How America nearly destroyed itself. The Civil War. America once tore itself apart. Brother took up arms against brother, son against father. 620,000 people died, more than in all of America's other wars combined. How did the country end up killing itself, and how did it survive at all? To understand this, we need to go back to a deal that was doomed to explode from the start.
A ticking time bomb. In the early 19th century, America wasn't made up of 50 states, just 13, and it kept growing. Every few years, another piece of territory would ask to join as a new state, and every time, the same frightening question came up. Would slavery be allowed in this new state or banned? Here's the thing. In Congress, America's legislature, every state got a vote. By 1820, there were exactly 11 slave states and 11 free states, the perfect balance. If the scale tipped either way, that side would gain more votes and could start dictating the rules for everyone else. Then, the Missouri Territory applied to join the Union, and Congress lost its mind. Politicians shouted at each other for 2 straight years. Thomas Jefferson, one of the country's founding fathers, was an old man by then, and he said the Missouri dispute frightened him like a fire bell ringing in the night. A politician named Henry Clay stepped in with a compromise. Missouri would join as a slave state, but Maine would join at the same time as a free state, keeping the balance intact. And a line would be drawn across the map. Above it, slavery would be permanently banned. Congress celebrated the win, but picture a school teacher somewhere in Virginia unrolling a big map in front of her class to explain the deal. A boy raises his hand and asks, "What happens when the land above that line runs out?" The teacher falls silent, rolls up the map, and changes the subject. That boy had asked exactly the question nobody wanted to think about. The problem hadn't been solved, only postponed. And meanwhile, the two halves of the country were turning into 2 completely different worlds.
2 different worlds under one roof. By the 1850s, the North and South barely resembled the same country. In the South, endless cotton fields, with around 84% of the population working the land, and an entire economy built on the labor of enslaved people. In the North, factories on every corner, railroads, growing cities swelling with millions of European immigrants. The North produced 32 times more firearms than the South. If this were a video game, one side had already upgraded to rocket launchers, while the other was still fighting with slingshots. The two halves wanted completely different things from their government. The North wanted high tariffs on imported goods, so people would buy from local factories instead. The South wanted low tariffs, so it could sell cotton abroad and buy cheap European goods. A cotton planter and a northern factory owner sitting side by side in Congress couldn't agree on anything, as if 2 different worlds had been crammed under one roof. And the argument that would eventually blow that roof off broke out over a small territory out west. Bleeding Kansas. The line drawn across the map to keep the peace was technically in effect, but America kept adding new Western territories, and each time the same question resurfaced. Should slavery be allowed here or not? In 1854, Congress came up with a new solution. Let the people living in each territory vote for themselves. It sounded fair enough, except both sides immediately started cheating. Kansas was the first test case. Pro-slavery settlers poured in from neighboring Missouri to rig the vote. Anti-slavery settlers flooded in from the north to do the same. The territory ended up with 2 separate governments, one pro-slavery, one anti-slavery, each claiming to be the legitimate one. Then the voting stopped, and the shooting started. This period became known as Bleeding Kansas. Mobs burned entire towns. Armed gangs raided farms in the dead of night. An abolitionist named John Brown, convinced that slavery had to be destroyed by force, led a series of violent raids against pro-slavery settlers. More than 50 people died, and the actual Civil War hadn't even started yet. All that was left was one spark to finally light the fuse. The election that blew the country apart. In November 1860, America held what was arguably the most dangerous election in its history. The country was so divided that even its political parties had split. The Democratic Party fractured into northern and southern factions, each with its own candidate. A third party fielded yet another contender. And then were the Republicans, a brand new party, only 6 years old, formed specifically to stop the spread of slavery into new territories. Their candidate was a tall, lanky lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's position was simple: slavery should not spread into new territories. He didn't even promise to end it where it already existed, just to stop it from growing. But to the South, that sounded like the beginning of the end. Here's the striking part. In 10 Southern states, Lincoln's name wasn't even on the ballot. It was physically impossible to vote for him there. And yet, he won, without a single vote from an entire region of the country. For the first time in history, a president had been elected without any support from a whole section of the nation. Southern leaders looked at the results and realized they had lost control of the federal government, possibly for good. The talking was over. Secession began. On December 20th, 1860, weeks before Lincoln even took office, South Carolina voted to leave the Union. Their reasoning was simple. They believed Lincoln would eventually destroy slavery, and slavery was the foundation of their entire way of life. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. 7 states vanished from the Union within weeks. They founded their own nation, the Confederate States of America, complete with its own flag, president, and army. A former Mississippi senator named Jefferson Davis was chosen to lead it.
Fort Sumter and the first shot. But the newborn Confederacy had one stubborn problem: a federal fort sitting in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, Fort Sumter, and its garrison had no intention of leaving. Lincoln took office on March 4, 1861, and almost immediately received alarming news. The fort was running out of food, and its soldiers would starve within weeks without resupply. He had 3 grim options: send warships and effectively start a war, abandon the fort and implicitly recognize the Confederacy as a real nation, or do nothing and let his own men starve. He chose a clever middle path, sending ships carrying only food, no weapons or reinforcements. He wasn't attacking, but he wasn't backing down either. At 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment lasted 34 straight hours. Walls cracked, fires broke out, and the fort's flag was shot down twice, with soldiers repeatedly running out to raise it again. Thousands of shells were fired, and remarkably, no one was killed in the bombardment itself. But the sound of those cannons was heard across the entire country. The next morning, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. 4 more Southern states, including Virginia, right on Washington's doorstep, joined the Confederacy. Everyone assumed the war would be over in about 90 days. They were badly wrong.
The illusion of a quick victory. Newspapers in Washington printed headlines like, "On to Richmond, the Confederate capital just 100 miles away." Union generals promised a swift victory. Some Washingtonians took this so literally that they packed picnic baskets and rode out in their carriages to watch the first major battle like a piece of theater, complete with food and opera glasses. The spot was a creek in Virginia called Bull Run. Instead of an easy win, the Union Army simply fell apart. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled back toward Washington in a panic, crashing into the very carriages that had come to watch. By the end of that single day, nearly 5,000 soldiers on both sides were dead, wounded, or missing. And this was supposed to be the easy war.
The Emancipation Proclamation. For months, Lincoln kept a secret document locked in his desk, the Emancipation Proclamation, an official order declaring every enslaved person in the rebel states free. His advisors begged him to wait. The Union was losing battle after battle, and releasing it now would look like an act of desperation. There was another concern too. Britain and France were considering support for the Confederacy, since the South supplied most of the world's cotton to European factories. On September 17, 1862, came the Battle of Antietam in Maryland, the single bloodiest day in American history. By sunset, roughly 22,700 soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. The Confederate Army pulled back, close enough to a Union win for Lincoln to finally seize his moment. On January 1, 1863, the proclamation took effect. Around 200,000 black men enlisted to fight for the Union, former slaves picking up rifles against the very system that had once enslaved them. The war to save the Union had become a war to end slavery. That they packed picnic baskets and rode out in their carriages to watch the first major battle like a piece of theater,
complete with food and opera glasses. The spot was a creek in Virginia called Bull Run. Instead of an easy win, the Union Army simply fell apart. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled back toward Washington in a panic, crashing into the very carriages that had come to watch. By the end of that single day, nearly 5,000 soldiers on both sides were dead, wounded, or missing. And this was supposed to be the easy war. Gettysburg and Vicksburg. In the summer of 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee gambled everything on an invasion of the North, marching into Pennsylvania in hopes that one major victory on Northern soil would force the North to sue for peace. Ironically, the Battle of Gettysburg itself broke out almost by accident. Confederate soldiers wandered into the small town looking for shoes, since their boots had worn out after months of marching, and ran into Union scouts. Both sides called in reinforcements, and by the third day, 165,000 soldiers had converged on a town most of them had never heard of. On that third day, Lee ordered one of the most doomed attacks in military history, infantry marching nearly a mile across open ground directly into entrenched positions with artillery on the high ground. Nearly half the attacking soldiers were left on that hillside. 1,000 miles to the west, at the same time, Union General Ulysses S. Grant had the city of Vicksburg under siege on the Mississippi River, the country's most vital waterway. On July 3rd, Lee's invasion collapsed at Gettysburg. The very next day, July 4th, Vicksburg fell. The Union now controlled the Mississippi, splitting the Confederacy in two. 2 battles in 1 week, and while the war could still drag on for years, the South's fate was effectively sealed. The end of the war. Lincoln found the man to finish the job, Grant, the hero of Vicksburg, and gave him one simple order: end it. Grant's strategy was almost reckless: attack constantly, never stop, never give Lee's army a chance to recover. Even when the Union lost individual battles, Grant refused to retreat, pushing forward again and again. The cost was staggering. In just 6 weeks during the spring of 1864, more than 55,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded. Newspapers began calling Grant a butcher. In September, the tide turned decisively. Union General William Sherman captured Atlanta, one of the South's largest and most important cities. Lincoln won re-election in a landslide. Sherman then marched his army 300 miles to the coast, burning farms, railways, and anything else the Confederate Army could use along the way, determined to destroy the South's ability to keep fighting. By April 1865, Lee's army was starving and surrounded. On April 9th, he surrendered to Grant at a small farmhouse in Virginia. After 4 years of war, the United States was one country again. Just 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln went to see a play, where a man named John Wilkes Booth crept up behind him and pulled the trigger. The man who had held the country together did not live to see what it would become.